Hello, and welcome to the Poisonpaintfactory. My factory designated name is Poison226. Nice to meet you.
Today, I want to talk about The Bride of Frankenstein. As he made his way angrily through the maze of metal, seeking a clear view, the monster heard Pretorius say, "You may come forward. It is time to claim your bride." The whole of her body was covered by the dress. Her arms were still bandaged. Individual bandages wrapped her fingers. Only her long triangular face was visible. Above her high, pale, absolutely smooth forehead, a hive of hair flourished. Parts of it were dark, but above each ear a tightly rippling silver wave mounted to a point. The deep, cloudy eyes gazed, bewildered, mysterious. Just who is the bride anyway? Why did Dr. Frankenstein make her? Did things work out for her and the monster? And how different might things have been if Dr. Frankenstein was a woman? Disclaimer. The information presented in this video is public information that I researched alongside my interpretation and opinions. Sources will be linked in the description, and yes, there will be spoilers. So, with all that said, let's get to it. Who is the Bride of Frankenstein? In the original book, she's never given a detailed description, but Frankenstein's monster is described as having yellowish skin stretched so thin it's almost translucent, with watery eyes and dark hair. It can be assumed his bride-to-be would be similar looking, since they share the same creation method. Once she moved to the big screen, the bride was first shown as tall and slender with electrified hair. She has innocent, wide eyes and dark lips. She dresses in a long white flowing dress that can be likened to a wedding dress. She is covered in bandages, and the stitching in her skin shows how she was pieced together. Future iterations of the bride would change her look in various ways, with some more monstrous than others. Mary Shelley was the daughter of political philosopher William Godwin and philosopher and women's rights advocate Mary Wollstonecraft. Shelley was a novelist and political radical most of her life, and a lot of her work reflected her point of view, one which was directly challenging to both her father's and her husband's political beliefs. It is said that Shelley conceived the idea of Frankenstein, also known as the modern Prometheus, when at Lake Geneva. She was visiting Lord Byron with her husband and stepsister. The group shared stories before deciding to write their own ghost story. Mary's husband Percy helped encourage her with turning the short story into a full novel, but to this day there are still differing opinions on how much Percy contributed and whether he should be considered editor or collaborator. Frankenstein is considered one of the early examples of science fiction and received a lot of attention when it was published. It has continued to garner interest and scholarly debate ever since. Ellen Mowers stated the novel is a birth myth, which helped Mary Shelley come to terms with the guilt of causing her own mother's death. while Anne Meller stated the novel is about what happens when a man tries to have a baby without a woman. As fascinating as it would be to explore the full written works of Mary Shelley and discuss their potential political and social meaning, we're here today to discuss one specific character. In the original version of Frankenstein, the bride is there, but the character is completely inanimate. The monster blackmails his creator, Dr. Frankenstein, into making a companion for him by threatening to kill Frankenstein's bride if he does not. Although Frankenstein builds the monster his bride, he does not bring her to life, resulting in the death of his betrothed at the hands of the monster. The bride first appeared on the big screen in 1935 in the Universal monster film, The Bride of Frankenstein. The plot has some similarities to the book and picks up narratively from the end of their earlier film, the 1931 Frankenstein. But in this movie, the monster is coerced into blackmailing Dr. Frankenstein by Dr. Septimus Pretorius, and of course, the bride lives. We don't get much insight into the bride as a character though, since, spoiler alert, she does not live for very long. Following her big screen debut, the bride, or more accurately the concept of her character, has starred in other movies, such as The Monster's Mate, Mad, Mad, Mad Monsters, Frankenstein, The True Story, Young Frankenstein, The Bride, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and most recently, Poor Things, as well as countless other iterations in animation, TV shows, novels, and books, all with varying depictions of the bride, from the more serious to the not so. There was a planned reboot by Universal as part of their Dark Universe, but the whole concept flopped after the first movie was released. Scarlett Johansson was also going to play the bride in yet another reimagining of the Frankenstein archetype, directed by Sebastian Lelio, but I couldn't find any recent articles about the project and can only assume it has been shelved. With a wealth of media to choose from, it was difficult to narrow down focus, but today we're going to explore the bride from just two different eras, starting of course with her debut. Mary Shelley's novel was adapted by William Hurlbut and John Balderston and released by Universal on the 22nd of April 1935. The film was a direct sequel to the 1931 film Frankenstein and is widely considered as superior, which is rare for a sequel. The monster was played by Boris Karloff, who reprised his role, as did Colin Clive, who played Dr. Frankenstein. The bride was portrayed by Elsa Lanchester. The makeup for the bride was done by Jack Pierce, the head of Universal's makeup department. Despite popular belief, the bride's hair is actually red and white, not black and white. The actress Elsa had red hair naturally, and it was reportedly brushed and styled over a wire cage to achieve the volume and shape inspired by Nefertiti. She did not wear a full wig, but instead wore small hair pieces for the grey streaks. In this movie, the bride is only on screen for a very short amount of time, right near the end. She is both cautious and curious, naive yet self-aware. Innocent yet knowing, she is repulsed by the monster, who decides that he, and those like him, were never meant to live. He causes the lab to explode, killing himself and his bride, who was never meant to be. Reportedly, director James Whale guided Elsa in her role with just one line of advice. Inside you pretty girls, there is the devil. And so with this in mind, it was Elsa's idea to add the hissers. She said she was inspired by the swans she and her husband would feed. They were beautiful, graceful, and curious creatures. But if you got too close, they would hiss viciously. The recorded vocals were then reversed to add to the strangeness. Without the full context of the novel it came from, the film alone does not overtly explore the concept of the ideal woman. But when seeking body parts, the doctor specifically requests young bodies, and the bride's stitching under her chin were put there deliberately to enhance her naturally beautiful jawline. We'll discuss a little more about constructed beauty and how the different versions of the bride can demonstrate the cultural assumptions of monstrosity and femininity later. So for now, let's look at our next film. Directed by Frank Rodham, this 80s romantic horror stars Jennifearbeals as the bride, alongside Sting, not that one, that's it, as Dr. Frankenstein. The film opens with a rather flamboyant theatrical retelling of the resurrection scene from the 1935 original. The bride is reanimated, the lab explodes, and
everybody is dead, Dave.
Well, not everyone. Dr. Frankenstein and the bride, later renamed Eva, make it out alive. And yes, I will be calling him Frankenstein from now on, because I don't like the fact that they changed Dr. Frankenstein's name from Victor to Charles. The film uses this intro as the springboard to tell some kind of extended alternate reality to Mary Shelley's original concept. The monster, confusingly now named Victor, also survives the lab explosion and runs away to join a circus with a dwarf named Ronaldo. The Victor plot focuses on the monster learning to be more human, developing a deep friendship with Ronaldo and getting acceptance within the circus, albeit a false and relatively short-lived acceptance. It's a pretty decent plot that I found quite interesting, and Clancy Brown's performance is really good in my opinion. Concurrent to this plot is the Eva plot. Her maker, Dr. Frankenstein, discusses with a friend about how he plans to retrain Eva into the perfect woman after he settles on the fake story of telling everyone he found the girl unconscious in the woods. The friend seems eager about the prospect of creating a perfect, submissive partner who is essentially all beauty and no brains. But Frankenstein insists he wants to create an independent, intelligent woman who should be considered equal to her male peers. The mere notion of this is scoffed at. Sadly, the film seems both too long and too short in all the wrong places. I felt more screen time was given to Victor and his character arc compared to Eva. And that's not to say Victor's story was uninteresting, but Eva's training and development amounted to a couple of scenes at best. One minute she's grunting and eating chicken with her hands. The next she's riding a horse side saddle whilst in full noble dress and talking ever so eloquently. For a film called The Bride, I would have expected her to have more on-screen development, especially with a setup for conflict on what constitutes the perfect woman. Eva, of course, does have a plot and decent screen time. It's just mainly focused on after she's become the woman Frankenstein raises her to be. He introduces her to high society, where she is romanced by Captain Joseph. This does set up some conflicting emotions for Frankenstein, who is apparently now unhappy about Eva being her own woman with free will and sexual independence, which is what he intended. Towards the end of the film, after Eva discovers her true monstrous identity and Frankenstein gets a bit too handsy, Victor saves the day and he and Eva head off into the sunset together. In our previous video about The Punisher, we discussed masculine representation in media, and more specifically the Hollywood superhero movies. But to me, and for the purpose of today's videos, one of the most interesting philosophies coming from the Frankenstein novel is that of the perfect human. Obviously, Frankenstein's first creation is male, and whilst the focus of this scientific endeavour seemed to be more about whether it could be done rather than the perfection of the male form, one could argue that choosing to create a man before a woman is itself a statement of sorts. Once we move towards the creation of the bride, however, there's no doubt that the focus shifts to perfecting the feminine form, visually as well as behaviourally. I won't deep dive into all the nuance of this very interesting topic. After all, there are many other articles and videos that cover this with far more grace and intelligence than I could attempt today, but I would like to go over this topic briefly with the two movies in mind. Between 1910 and 1960 is considered a golden age for Hollywood. Films became cheaper to produce, allowing the price of admission to go down. This, coupled with synchronized sound replacing the silent film era, increased the popularity of movies in the wider population. Actors became idolized as stars, but things were not all glitz and glamour. As we know from the ever-increasing amount of news reports today, assault, harassment, and violence are a common issue faced by many within the industry, particularly for women. Beyond the direct abuse of women, sexism was common in Hollywood during the Golden Age. It was expected that women look and behave a certain way, and they rarely got the chance to direct films or make major creative choices. Outside the film industry, around 1920, women fought for and successfully obtained the vote alongside workplace fairness, safety, and minimum wages. Unfortunately, by 1930 and the Great Depression, there were fewer jobs available and many industries chose to hire men instead of women. Slowly but surely, motherhood and housewifery was seen as the only true path for women. However, the film industry was one where women appeared to be thriving. Some actresses were even taking home salaries bigger than their male counterparts, which was something truly unheard of. But there was a catch. Most of the movies in the 1930s aimed to sell audiences the idea that a woman's place was in the home. Any films that had a strong and independent female character would ultimately U-turn by having that same strong independent character give it all up for the love of a man and the cosy, safe life of being a housewife and mother. Another thing to remember is that during the golden age of film, the feminine image that was portrayed on screen was vastly different depending on the socio-economic status of the women involved, with upper class and working class women receiving very different depictions. The issue of women's rights was not widely tackled again in general and political society until the 1960s and 1970s, during the second wave feminism. This meant for the majority of Hollywood's golden age, women were powerless to obtain anything more than was given to them by the executives in charge. As we moved to the 1980s, feminism in American society was on the rise as people fought for equality and laws were passed to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. Film often reflected the social status of the era, and in the 1980s, the formation of the sex-positive feminism movement gave rise to women taking back control over their own sexual lives. Sexual freedom, after all, is an essential component of women's freedom. There was another boom of movies starring the ever-seductive femme fatale character, alongside new types of strong, independent women. The Bride attempts to transpose this real-life social issue into its narrative, which is set in 1840. The film tried to give the character Ava her intelligence, sexual independence, and strength to be her own person, one to be considered of equal standing against men, which for the period of time within the movieverse was absolutely unheard of. In reality, the seed for the first women's rights convention in the US was only planted in 1840 after all, when Elizabeth Stanton met Lucretia Mott at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. At the time of the film's release in 1985, the topic of equality was reflective of the shift in changing attitudes of and towards women. So how did these real-life issues alter the two films, and in general, the principle of the character, Bride of Frankenstein? Since the bride rejects her role as mate to a monster, we can argue that the 1935 Bride symbolizes free thought and challenges gender-specific expectations, something which was not common for women in film in the 30s. However, a majority of the marketing leading up to the film leaned towards the mystery of the bride in visual terms. Who will dare play her? What will she look like? The official trailer even puts this before the shocking revelation that the monster can now talk. Something which actor Boris Karloff hated, by the way. The 1985 Bride trailer spends most of its time setting up the potential outcry at Frankenstein's interpretation of a perfect woman and the ensuing conflict between him and Ava as he trains her, which is disappointing, since the actual movie has more focus on the monster and dwarf story arc instead. I can see why people felt let down by the movie after seeing that trailer. Of course, it goes without saying that both movies chose to cast conventionally slim and attractive women as the star, leaning more towards femininity rather than monstrosity, with only carefully placed makeup effects that did not detract from their starting beauty. Interestingly, the 1994 Frankenstein film, directed by Kenneth Branagh, cast the beautiful Helena Bonham Carter as Elizabeth. But when she becomes the bride, they did a brilliant job with the makeup to show the true monstrosity of reanimation. Of course, Helena's pretty face is still visible under the prosthetics, but it's good to see a version of the bride that wasn't afraid to show how dreadfully monstrous she could be, more akin to her male counterpart than other iterations had been previously. But I digress. One absolutely scathing review published just 3 days after the theatrical release of the 1985 movie summarizes it all with, "Dwarf is more interesting." They also make a point of stating how much of a mess the nude scene is because it's clearly a body double. I have to say, this irked me a little. It comes across as if the reviewer is annoyed that they didn't get to see the full frontal nude body of the actress he wanted, downplaying the fact that a woman was willing to bear all on camera just because she wasn't actually jennifearbeals. This, of course, is my opinion, and I can't say with certainty that the reviewer intended his words to be taken this way. And yet, I wonder, what might make me feel this way to begin with? Could it be perhaps to do with the fact that Hollywood is constantly telling us what a perfect woman should look like, and that there are those in society who start to feel entitled to that standard? That they can criticize and bully those who don't meet the exceptionally high bar that visual media sets? We touched on some of these issues, but from the male perspective in our Punisher video, and if you're interested, it's linked below in the description. I want to briefly pick up that thread and continue to discuss it today with the feminine form in mind, Seems fitting after all, since The Bride of Frankenstein is about the creation of the perfect woman. The dangerous beauty standards expected of our celebrities is shocking and sad, and it affects everyone in and out of Hollywood. There are stories of girls as young as 16 nearly starving to death because all they eat are cotton balls. Women writing down how much water they drink so they can keep track of their weight. Diets consisting of cigarettes, coffee and laxatives only. Even elsalanchester is quoted as saying, "Stardom is all hard work, aspirins and purgatives." Women are being reduced to a set of perfect numbers for hip, waist and bust size and not a single inch more. Weight tracked as a number, never to stray above the dreaded triple digits in pounds, and certainly never double digits for clothing size. What's that? You're 101 pounds and a size bigger than 0? Sorry, that's not the standard we're looking for. Maybe it wouldn't feel so hurtful if it was a simple but polite rejection, but that's rarely the case. Alicia Silverstone renamed by the press as Fat Girl when starring in the Batman and Robin movie. Mindy Kaling rejected at an audition to star in a comedy about her own life because she wasn't attractive enough. Samantha Morton told she was too fat for a lead role. Jennifer Lawrence told to lose weight or be fired. Margaret Cho rejected as being too overweight to play herself in a semi-autobiographical sitcom, then hospitalised with kidney failure from not eating. Ashley Benson told she was too fat for a role when she was a size 2. Amy Schumer being told if you weigh over 140 pounds on screen, it will hurt people's eyes. And it's not just women, of course. David Harbour was rejected for the role of the Blob because he was considered too fat. Chris Pratt told that he was too fat, which triggered him to start crash dieting in response. This level of bullying and viciousness towards people just trying to live inside their own skin, it's just horrible. And it's not just the visual media. Bridget Jones' Diary was written by Helen Fielding in 1996 and adapted for the big screen in 2001. If you're unfamiliar with the story, in brief, it's about a woman struggling with her purpose and direction in life, still being single in her 30s and absolutely obsessing over her body. The character meticulously records her weight, which was actually already under 140 pounds. The average weight of women in America in 1999 was around 164 pounds. When the film was released, actress Renee Zellweger gained 30 pounds to play the role and quickly lost it afterwards before regaining it again for the sequel. Both the book and the film were heavily criticised for linking Bridget's misery directly to her weight. When her numbers were low, she was happy and thriving. When she was eating and her numbers were up, she was a failure. This book affected a lot of women and has been accused of teaching women to hate their bodies and that being fat is the worst thing that can happen to them. For my part, well, I remember reading the book and watching the movie and constantly thinking, wait, if she is a fat failure, then what the heck am I? Interestingly, I found an old diary of mine that also made note of my weight, also under 140 pounds at the time, and lamented on how disgustingly high that number was. Most of my entries consisted of bullying myself, calling myself disgusting, and planning anything and everything within my power to shed those pounds. I was only 14 at the time. Bridget was in her 30s. Eating disorders, body dysmorphia, these are not easy to overcome, no matter how many years later. Media has always displayed, sometimes more overtly than other times, that being big equals ugly, and ugly equals worthless. It seems to imply, as Renee herself said, that one way of being is acceptable and the other isn't valuable. That's just not true. Now, before anyone takes my commentary out of context here, I absolutely agree and recognise that people are entitled to their preference when it comes to finding someone attractive. But I simply observe that there is a huge difference between people having their own personally developed preferences versus people having their preferences spoon-fed to them by mass visual media. It becomes an entirely other level of unacceptable to then aggressively imprint your belief on everyone else through bullying. I think this is what makes the idea of a Bride of Frankenstein movie so difficult to make and yet so utterly compelling to try. Do you lean into what society deems as beautiful at the time of making the movie? Do you make it a period piece and use the standards set from then? Do you deliberately cast off the current acceptable standard and go polar opposite? If a perfect woman can be created, but the cost is she must be reanimated, an undead monster, how do you balance the femininity and the monstrous? How do you show a boundary creature that can disturb our very notion of what it means to be human, whilst simultaneously radiating an otherworldly yet oddly familiar beauty? How do you convey the difficulty Dr. Frankenstein has with creating something that he thinks is right, versus what is right for the monster, versus what is right for the bride herself? And how does she react when she learns of her creation? How does she judge the decisions and standards that have been set for her against her own thoughts, feelings, and preferences? Monsters, whether male or female, writes Elaine Graham, mark the fault lines, but also subversively signal the fragility of the boundaries between humans and almost humans. These are the kinds of things that can make for compelling storytelling. These questions have the power to hold a mirror up to the beauty industry and Hollywood, show them who the real monster is. And not just Hollywood. There are different perceptions of beauty across the globe, across various industries. An interesting article I came across in my research was Perceptions of Perfection Across the Borders. It was so eye-opening to see how different the images were. Oh, and just to be clear, I again acknowledge that everyone is absolutely entitled to their preferences. But if you don't find something or someone attractive, just keep it to yourself. Don't be a bully, yeah? So, before we get into the alternate reality, how do you think this video connects with the last? I'll give you a clue. Whilst we did talk about body standards in both of these videos, that's not the only link. If Dr. Frankenstein had been a woman, what would her original and subsequent creations have looked like? Well, let's consider that in the real world, women were essentially banned from science in the early 19th century, when the original Frankenstein was written. The only way to learn was from their brothers or fathers, teach themselves through books, or forgo all social norms and just do it. I believe Mary Shelley would have written a female Dr. Frankenstein as a tragic character, torn between the wishes of her mother to be an attractive young lady available for marriage and to bear children to the right suitor, and the wishes of her father to be an intellect with a wild imagination and thirst for knowledge. Dr. Frankenstein would, to the best of her ability, try and juggle this duality of personality to appease both her parents. By day, she would meet and greet all the most eligible bachelors her mother chose for her. By night, she would talk science and philosophy with her father before using his lab once he slept. Her secret scientific studies would eventually lead to that of creation, a way to merge her mother's wishes with her father's. I think from there, Dr. Frankenstein would have settled on the idea of making children in a more scientific manner. She would probably not mutilate corpses to get what she needed. I think she would want to grow new life in test tubes. I think she would focus on some kind of perfect assimilation of societal stereotypical expectations for both men and women, beauty and brains. As she works hard to keep her scientific experiments secret, whilst also going along with her wedding planning, she would become very worried about the gender expectations of her children. She would not want this same kind of pressure for them, to have to hide their identity, their preferences. And so, when taking what she considers to be the best traits from both sexes, her creations become androgynous. Dr. Frankenstein's children are, in her eyes, perfect. But what happens when she finally shares the fruits of her scientific labours? How will her parents react? How will the world react? And what about her new husband? What will he say when she introduces him to their ready-made family? Well, I guess I'll just have to write the book now. The building collapsed. The rubble of the walls poured inward. Bricks stunned the creature, numbing his nerves. As he fell to his knees, the fire reached him. It was quickly over, and he felt little pain. Yet before he blazed, he had time to realise that Dr. Frankenstein must have brought down fire from the sky at the beginning to give him life. Perhaps the fire had returned to reclaim him. Whew, this sure was fun. I'm glad I was brought to life to tackle this subject, and I hope you enjoyed my rendition. We covered some serious issues today, albeit briefly, but it's always fascinating to explore the parasitic relationship between media and real life, each one perpetuating the other. When does the drama end and real life begin? Does life imitate art, or vice versa? Am I just a construct, a boundary creature hovering in the space between awake and asleep? The time when both sun and moon kiss the horizon. When will the fires of life and death come to reclaim me?
And so, with all that said, thank you for your time. I wish you a good day, and many more besides. Yours, forever in horror, 226.
Move on. Good night all, and pleasant dreams.
Ah, pleasant dreams yourself. Thinks he's everybody just because he's a
painting master.